Okay. Okay, and we're live. I see it streaming on LinkedIn, so we should be good to go. So, hi everyone. Welcome back to another Breaking Into Data session. Again, I'm Aaron Palouse. For those of you who don't know me, or this is your first event, welcome. I'm the founder and CEO of Promotable, and your host for tonight's Breaking Into Data session, and of course, every Breaking Into Data session every week. And with me tonight, I've got. I was going to say Scott Schneider, Simon Schneider, who you guys might remember from a previous talk, a previous panel. So that was really cool. So we've invited him back to dive into the technical interview. We all have to do it. There's some ways to approach these things. Obviously, they're all a little different, but there is a kind of a reference point that we should all be able to follow. And of course, this is your opportunity to ask any question you want. Please take the opportunity. And of course, my co-host Scott Adams. You've seen his talks before as well, so really deep expertise. So really excited to get this going. And before we start, I know some of you have signed up for next week's event. For those of you who want to know what it's like to work as an analyst at Spotify, check that out. And then aside from that, so Promotable, what we do, we fill data skill gaps, right? So at the end of the day, we do that by helping connect you with data practitioners through events like this. Of course, we have our part-time courses as well, instructors just like tonight's speakers. So those are all part-time, designed for folks who are in marketing or product or finance who want to break in or just add that data toolkit to what you already do. So go ahead and check that out on our website, promotable.io. And last thing, shameless plug, please give us a like and a follow, really helpful. And final announcement, this event will be recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel. It's actually on the YouTube channel right now. So if you go on, you'll see it. And we're good to go. So with that, Simon, if you want to take it away, I'll pull your deck up and then we're good to go. Let me take that off.
Excellent. Well, hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, taking some time to fill some data skill gaps. So yeah, my name's Simon Schneider. I've been doing data science professionally since 2015 now. That photo is me as a much younger man. So these days, I'm at Provi. For those of you who don't know, Provi is the go-to technical solution for liquor license holders to order and soon pay for all their alcohol. So we just raised about 75 million in Series C. We're currently looking for a data analyst. We're going to have some recs for data scientists and data engineers in the near future. So while we're here, let's also extend our thanks to Aaron and Promotable for having us all out tonight. This is a wonderful show they put on. And it's an incredible resource for any data professional. So yeah, the plan for tonight is to continue in that tradition. So welcome one and all to cracking the data science technical interview. So since 2015, I've done several job interviews, sometimes successfully. And I think the single most important fact about them, the source of most of the problems that we could plausibly fix about them, is a fundamental data collection shortcoming. Simply on the screen, companies never get feedback on candidates that they don't hire. So at first, this seems kind of obvious, maybe unimportant, but it's actually rather pernicious. So imagine you're a data scientist, you're solving a binary classification problem, hire this person or not, but most of the population in your data set is censored according to someone else's model, which you don't have access to. And you can assume that that previous model that censored your data was also trained on a data set similarly censored by the model before it. So suddenly it's really not hard to see how any number of biases could creep into that process and prove hard to root out. But it's worse than even that. So if we unpack this fact a bit more, you can see that the cost of letting a good employee slip through the cracks of your interview process is literally nothing, right? You never find out that that employee would have made you millions of dollars. You never know. No cost, no benefit. But in contrast, the cost for admitting a bad employee is actually quite high. You have to pay them while they presumably do bad work, and then you have to find the effort to remove them. So as a result, by default, the purpose of a job interview is actually to weed out bad candidates and not to evaluate the skills of good ones. So think about that. Interviews by default are kind of interrogations. Are you lying on your resume? Do you have the skills you say you do? Have you really done the things you say you've done? Now, this style of interviewing is really off-putting for candidates. And also, like, it really doesn't help companies decide between two good candidates, right? You can identify whether someone's good or not, but if you have to choose between two good ones, it doesn't help you. So most companies have figured out how to give behavioral interviews instead of what might be called job qualification interrogations. But sadly, like, the technical portion is still kind of hit or miss. Like, in a perfect world, I think the technical interview would be a collaborative celebration of human ingenuity and problem solving. I've had a few that were almost that good. Typically, they're given by more experienced interviewers who know how to ask high quality, open-ended questions. And luckily, those questions happen to overlap with some area of my expertise. So interviews like that are time really well spent. I walked away with a good sense for how the interviewer, and by extension the team, thought about the problems, what was important to them, and whether I could work with them. So a great technical interview makes it easier to say yes to a job offer when one comes. But on the other hand, I've gotten technical interviews where the questions were super narrow, worse, purely academic with no real obvious business use, in a domain that I wasn't warmed up on, and with an inexperienced interviewer who only had their one favorite right answer in mind. So those job interviews I tend not to do so well on. So what's the intrepid job seeker to do? How do you maintain your positive attitude and indeed your sanity in the face of repeated and impersonal rejection? Is the job search just a numbers game where you throw yourself into enough open requirements until you eventually get lucky? Well, a lot of us enter the workforce with stories in our heads about how if we don't get a job offer, it means our skills, that our skills or indeed our worth were lacking. But the thing is, most interviews don't result in offers, which means that if you have this set of assumptions, most job interviews end in suffering, which means that most job interviews begin with fear, which hurts your performance, and the cycle repeats. So let me tell you how I avoided that cycle, because that was honestly the biggest hurdle for me to get through. And this idea began, amusingly enough, when I was thinking about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a fascinating work. It's designed to be read to somebody who's recently died for the first couple of weeks after they die. And it's really designed to provide context about what the Tibetan Buddhists believe a soul experiences in the so-called bardo of death. Now, this book describes that in the first week after death, one is visited by dozens of benevolent deities, analogous in some ways to so many idealizations of a wise, kind, experienced interviewer, inviting the candidate simply to bask in the clear light of their own awareness. But if they're not enlightened after the first week, the dead soul is hounded during the second week by dozens of wrathful deities who torment the soul for their selfish ignorance. And doesn't that sound a little bit like your most recent bad job interview? But the key to success, how to achieve enlightenment from the bardo of death, so says the Book of the Dead, is simply to recognize that the benevolent and the wrathful deities both are projections of your own mind. The benevolent deities are manifestations of your own infinite completeness, and the wrathful deities are the unsparing face of your own wakefulness. Every moment is an invitation to be courageous and remember who you are. Now, I'm no Buddhist, but I think that's decidedly beautiful. So, what got me out of that cycle of fear and pain was simply to realize that a job offer is indeed a wonderful outcome, but there are a lot of other positive outcomes that typically come from job interviews. So let's think about this. A job interview is an opportunity in a lot of ways. It's an opportunity to get exposure to new technical and business problems. It's an opportunity to get candid feedback from your interviewer. It's an opportunity to figure out what kinds of jobs you don't want. Sometimes it's an opportunity to be informed, sometimes aggressively, of techniques that you don't yet know and should. Sometimes it's an opportunity to have fun. And critically for our purposes tonight, past technical job interviews are the single best opportunities to practice for future technical interviews. Bad interviews are the best opportunities for growth. But I think really the key here is that interviews are first and foremost whatever the candidate and the interviewer project onto the interview. I started having more fun and performing better once I learned how to project opportunity rather than risk. Interviewers pick up on this and they have more fun too. The bardo of job interview definitely requires skills unto itself, basically independent of a lot of the skills required for the jobs behind them. But like all skills, it just takes good practice. And it turns out that the data science technical interview actually is much simpler than data science itself. I genuinely enjoy most interviews these days. Once I stopped suffering from them, I remembered that talking to smart people about cool problems is actually one of my favorite pastimes. So your mileage may vary, but if you can get to the point where you view job interviews as opportunities rather than obligations or risks, you can feel better and perform better too. So that's the groundwork laid. Now, for some of you, that realization and the associated context, might be enough. But I realize that it's pretty abstract on one hand, so you might not know how to apply it. And on the other hand, many of you already know this and probably have questions about how to actually answer questions about job interviews. So what I also want to walk you through are my 5 steps for every technical interview. The first 3 are basically preparation beforehand. The 4th one is day of, and then number 5 is afterwards. So these steps both build upon and further explain the theme of interview as opportunity. And I think some of you will find them all useful, but I think all of you will find at least some of them useful. So step 1 is to process your history. Everybody has a history that's relevant to technical interviews. And for most of us, some of that history was painful. Now, Faulkner wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." I think that's a beautiful sentiment, but I prefer the more modern expression of this idea in the so-called internal family system of psychotherapy. So if you think back, everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but most of us have some experience when you were in nth grade and you raised your hand and thought you had the question right. And not only were you wrong, but the teacher made you feel dumb for it, and they were mean to you. Or you can just think about that time you were in high school when your friend called you a nerd and suddenly you like math a little less. Or you can just think about the last bad interview you had. So all of these past experiences, whether you want them to or not, are going to contribute to the thoughts, feelings, and assumptions that you're bringing to your present interviews. And critically, if you haven't taken the time to recapitulate those hurt pieces of your younger self, it's possible that that's actually hindering your performance. So many of us don't notice this, but one of the superpowers of the human mind is the ability to conceal things from itself. There's actually a theorem out there from evolutionary game theory. The title of the paper is "Fitness Beats Truth in the Evolution of Perception." And I think the title is basically self-explanatory. So when we have an experience that our internal system finds intolerable, the tendency is to take that experience and to push it out of sight and out of mind. Now, the problem is that that takes a lot of effort. And that effort might frankly be better spent thinking creatively about how to solve the question the interviewer just asked you. And when large swaths of your mind are jumping through hoops to avoid thinking about something, it's really hard to evaluate what's going on in an objective way. So what's also easy to forget about all this is that we're learning and growing all the time. And experiences that were intolerable to you in the past, you might now have the ability to manage. So if we can find those parts of our younger selves that experience those intolerable experiences, reconnect them to our present self, and process that pain with our newfound capacity, it frees up large swaths of our mind to do other things, such as decide to focus on the inherent opportunities of that upcoming interview. So let me inject the caveat that I'm no mental health practitioner, and you should all talk to your own therapists about this. But here's a technique that works for me. When I notice that there's something I'm avoiding thinking about, usually during a job interview preparation, I stop, I close my eyes, and with my thoughts, I invite that feeling to come and talk. If it does, I try to feel the negative feelings associated with it and any feelings behind those feelings, just as much or as little as I have the capacity to handle right then. If it's too much, I say that's enough and it stops. But the most important step, with my thoughts, I thank those negative feelings. Their job was to keep me safe, and here I am right now, just fine. So they did great work, and now they can stop. Typically, this gets a lot of adrenaline flowing in my body, so some mindful physical activity is great for working that out. It can be running, hitting a pillow, can even just be imagining some kind of physical activity. Whatever my body feels like it wants, and then doing it until it feels like the danger is past. And then to finally cement this feeling of return to baseline, to bring yourself to a sense of safety, it's good to have some kind of positive interaction with a friend, loved one, pet, even a friendly stranger. Eye contact with a fellow mammal goes a long way toward helping us feel safe and present. And then I repeat that process basically as often as I'm able to. Every iteration helps a little bit, and they do build up over time. So step 1 is awful for some people, and it's actually trivial for others. Life, as it has been noted, is rather unfair. But even those of you without painful histories typically do well to examine your preconceptions and exhibit a little bit of curiosity about where they might have come from. Step 1 is really designed to give you greater control over your feelings and thoughts, and that will make every subsequent step a little bit easier and more productive. Because indeed, step 2 is literally all about shaping your thoughts for the interview. I think about this step in terms of crafting my narrative. And by my narrative, I mean that it's mine. I am the only audience member for this particular story. Don't get me wrong, I've got my personal elevator pitch that I give to people when I meet them at a conference or whatever. I could probably recite my answer to the dreaded, "So tell me about yourself," in my sleep. But, these are narratives I craft, and they have many elements in common with my personal narrative, but they serve different purposes, right? So, for my elevator pitch, my goal is to give someone my history and give them a sense of where I'm at and what I'm looking for. But that's already step 1, my history. So the purpose of my personal narrative is to help me situate myself in the interview when I find myself there. The big stories to answer are, why did I take this interview? What do I need to see from them to accept an offer if it comes? What skills do I think this job requires? And how can I demonstrate these skills in an interview? As well as, what other potential good outcomes am I looking for? Parsing job descriptions is kind of hard. So a good idea at this step, if you're having a hard time crafting your narrative, especially about what skills the job requires and how you need to demonstrate them, is to reach out to your recruiter to see if they can give you any information about what questions might be asked. And once you have that story, you have some idea of what you need to study in order to make those things true, in order to really round out your knowledge and be able to demonstrate everything that you think you need to know for that job. Now, those of you who did have a hard time in step 2 probably have a strong internal voice of criticism, and that's actually a superpower for this step. Strong internal critics are going to be more vigilant and more fierce than any real-life interviewer, and they're happy to point you to specific holes in your story, and that tells you exactly what new skills you should pick up before the interview. Other people are going to have a hard time finding the holes in their own stories. They can miss the fact that they don't understand some fundamental piece, or maybe they ignore whole fields entirely. Again, the brain's superpower is to ignore things that are inconvenient to it. So it can be helpful if you can't find any holes in your own story to get some feedback from a friend or colleague, although do bear in mind that they're going to be less harsh than any real interviewer. And of course, hard technical interviews themselves are the single best chance to identify holes in your story. But once you have your story figured out, you just really need to believe it during the interview. The goal is that when I'm in my interview, I should feel strongly in my bones that if my understanding of this role is correct, then I belong in this interview, and the company would be wise to extend me an offer. Of course, if my guesses are wrong, maybe I need to revise my narrative for next time. It's hard to work. It gets easier with practice. Don't beat yourself up about it, no matter what. Now, once you got your mindset right, I think step 3 is probably what most of you actually thought you were coming to learn tonight. So this is how to work smarter, not harder, when you're preparing for job interviews. And all you have to do is build a mental map. So what does this look like? Every question I look at when I'm preparing for an interview, I don't start by solving it. I start by asking 2 questions. Number 1, what's the simplest possible version of this question? With the caveat that, big complicated problems may be broken down into multiple different simplest versions, reflecting different subparts of the subproblem. And then secondly, what is a version of this complicated question that's almost the same, but different in one way? So after I've done that, I have, 3 questions. I repeat those 2 questions a few more times until I've got, maybe 6, maybe a dozen related questions. And then I start solving them, starting with the simplest versions. Then I ask, okay, once I've solved the simplest versions, how can I use my solution for the simple questions to solve the more complicated version? And then I can look at the 2 related but slightly different complicated questions and say, can I use my solution for one to inform my solution for other? If so, how? If not, why not? So an example of this, you might get a sample question about calculating a covariance matrix from samples. Maybe the question is to write a function that consumes a NumPy array and returns the covariance matrix or something. So my first question that I'll look at is, okay, how about just 3 samples in just 2 dimensions? And I'll do that example, calculate the covariance matrix by hand. After that, I can understand what each term does in my covariance matrix calculation. It gets really easy to write the code for that. I can also think about, what if I had histograms instead of samples? How accurately can I still estimate a covariance matrix? Well, maybe I can't estimate a covariance matrix accurately enough, but if I have those histograms, maybe I can construct a contingency matrix and run a test for independence instead, etc., etc. Once you have your list of questions, as I say, start with the simple ones and then build up from there. So I stumbled on this mental map idea basically by accident during my years and years as a math tutor, when I would see dozens of variations of the same few core related problems. But it actually aligns really well with some science I've discovered recently. So neuroscientists are starting to talk about this idea of coordinate frames. The idea, as I understand it, is that the neocortex in your brain works essentially by estimating the relationships between pieces of information it knows. So, my chair is next to the desk, both in my office, both in my house, etc. And it turns out that this way of representing information works just as well for literal or abstract information. You can hear either Jeff Hawkins or indeed Jeff Hinton talk wax poetic about these in terms of things that they wish they could make neural networks do. But if you've ever used the technique of a memory palace, you actually already know this. For those of you who haven't used that technique, it's a simple technique where you think about a place you know really well, and then you imagine yourself walking through that place, and at each point, each step, you put down a visual reminder of some piece of information you want to remember. And then to retrieve that piece of information, you imagine yourself re-walking through that place, you remember where you put it, you see the visual reminder, and it reminds you. Absolutely amazing. But it's the same idea, right? We situate this information relative to other information that we know. And so the goal of building your mental map is really that once you understand the question during an interview, you can suddenly recognize it as, oh, hey, this is only 3 questions to the left and 2 questions more complicated, or whatever, relative to one of the questions you practiced on. And once that happens, you're ready for step 4, game day. So all you have to do is execute what you practice. Although I admit, that does make it sound much easier than it is. For me, routine is key leading up to the interview. I have to get good sleep. I have to eat a good breakfast. I usually take in some caffeine. My other secret weapon is a B vitamin complex. Those are really good, active ingredient of 5-hour energy. And then, when I'm getting ready, I practice my story. I remind myself that I belong there. I get my headspace right. I think about what the opportunities are. Once the interviewer enters the room, I exchange pleasantries. That's an important part of my routine. Hey, how's your day going? Oh, great. Yeah, joke about the weather, whatever. And then go. It's a lot like a sprinter at the start of a race, right? On your mark, get set, bang. And by bang, you're ready. But the counterintuitive part happens right after bang. Slow down. Make sure you understand the question. I sometimes take up to 1/3 of my time just making sure I understand what's being asked, because I've gotten burned by that before. Ask clarifying questions. Probe for context. Remember, you're also assessing whether you want to work on the problems that this team solves. See if you can understand why they're asking you that specific question. It might give you some insight. If you can't figure it out, you can even maybe ask at the end of the interview. In addition to making sure you're answering the right question, this technique has the excellent effect of stalling for time to let your subconscious place this question in your mental map. Which simple exercises are relevant, and how do I get from there to the answer to the actual question? If you can place this question in your mental map, just articulating your thought process can be a winning strategy. I know that in this simple case, we do that. And then this relates to the question you're asking in this way. And you can flesh that out, and lo and behold, you've successfully solved the problem. Another thing to think about is you should really practice describing your thought process as you're solving a question. Maybe have a friend next to you as you're typing up a method and just dictate what you're doing. Maybe practice live coding. If that's something you really struggle with, dive right in. Can't hurt. So those interviews where you cannot place the question on your mental map, I don't know. It's going to be harder to get an offer from those, right? It's not insalvageable. You can definitely still demonstrate knowledge. You can think about the question and find the context and demonstrate what you do know. But the reality is, it's not a problem. It just means that my narrative back in step 2 was missing something. And I'm in the process of receiving excellent feedback for all of my subsequent interviews about what I need to know for this kind of job. An attitude of humility and confidence goes a long way in either case. Remember, if you've interpreted the job description right, you belong here. And if not, that's really great information to know. So after the interview, once it's all over, I take a deep breath And I congratulate myself. Pat on the back. Maybe I take a walk, depending on the time of day. Maybe I'll crack a cold beer. Congratulations all around. Good work, Simon. Now, what most people proceed to do is promptly to forget some or all of the amazing rich data set that was just handed to them. You have to remember that the brain's superpower is concealing intolerable things, like hard job interviews, from itself. What I suggest you do instead of forget is to write stuff down. At a bare minimum, what questions you were asked and how you answered them. You may have immediate strong opinions about how you should have answered them. If so, it basically means you'll never forget how to answer that particular question again. Or maybe you still have no idea what exactly that question means, which is itself very useful to know. If you're not sure whether your answers were good, a friend or colleague is a great resource, and you should keep jotting things down that you remember or think of days later. Getting an offer is correlated with a lot of things other than just the technical interview. So unfortunately, it's not a very good signal to train your behavior on. So whether you get an offer or not, I encourage you to ask for explicit feedback from your recruiter or from the interviewer themselves. And then once you have this feedback, either your own or external, you can revisit each step in turn. Hard interview questions can take some work afterwards to process. Make sure you process any new pain so that you can derive the maximal benefit from that interview. Questions you didn't expect or a faltering of your confidence during the interview indicate that either your narrative wasn't quite right or you don't believe it. And that's a great place to work too. It will take me the rest of my life and I still won't have my mental map completed to my own satisfaction. But technical interviews are great because they alert me to what I should work on next in terms of completing my mental map. Did you enter the interview in a state of relaxed anticipation? Did you feel alert and sharp? If not, maybe you need to alter your routine leading up to the interview. And finally, if you find days later that you had a question about the interview and you've just gone and forgotten it, well, that's great feedback about what you need to write down. So in summary, we all have to do job interviews. Job interviews and indeed the technical screens are inevitable, but fortunately, suffering does not need to be. So by this combination of focusing on the positives, the opportunities, remembering that the downsides are actually kind of minimal, and by working smarter and not harder, I believe that you too can perform better and have more fun at your job interviews. And I believe, Aaron, you wanted me to walk through a story of a particular question I got, huh?
Yeah, I think that would be really good to like cement all this in. And I do have a question for you afterwards, like taking the moderator's prerogative, if you will.
By all means, by all means. So yeah, great story I have for you is my worst train and wreck interview in the last 2 years or so. So this was one where, about 10 minutes afterwards, I started answering the question, realized I didn't understand it at all. Oops. So stumbled through it. At that point, I was much too flustered to remember basic probability. Oops. And didn't get an offer from that. And indeed, went home and tried to forget the interview and then thought about, no, this is actually a great opportunity. I need to remember all this stuff. And actually, to help me process that history from that interview, I ended up running a reading group over at Bradsteel's, or Basic Statistics. There is no way to learn anything quite as well as teaching it. So that was a great recapitulation from my perspective. The specific question I want to highlight was a really interesting one that I wish I'd been able to interpret and indeed answer in the hour allotted to me. So imagine that you've got a 2D grid. So, from 0 to 1 to 1, 1 to 1, 0. So 1 by 1 box. Somewhere in that box, there is a target point. You don't know where it is. It is selected at random uniformly from that region. And then there are also a collection of sensors, which are also sampled uniformly from that box. You don't know the position of the sensors, but you do know for each sensor, whether it's to the left or the right, and whether it's up or down from the target. And so then the question is, based on the input from the sensors, make some estimate of the position of the target. And so, yeah, that's a complicated question. It took me longer than it should have to understand what it meant, and it wasn't presented as clearly as I did for you. But immediately afterwards, my thought was, hey, wait a minute, there's a simpler version of this question. Let's not put it in a box. Let's put it on a number line between 0 and 1. Let's make it a one-dimensional version. There's also an even simpler version. Rather than multiple sensors, let's just have one sensor. So then at that point, the question is, all right, you've got 2 points uniformly sampled from 0, 1. You know whether one point is to the left of the other or to the right of the other. And then the question is, can you construct some estimate for the probability distribution of the target point? And it turns out that, yeah, it's actually not too bad. You just have to apply basic conditional probability. And what you find is that it's a triangle sloped in either direction, depending on whether your target is to the left or right of the sensor. So, okay, cool. That's the simpler version of the problem solved. Then zooming out to multiple sensors. Well, okay, how does that work? So each sensor is an independent contribution. So you just need to essentially consider those all together. And lo and behold, you find, hey, it makes a polynomial rather than a triangle. From there, I could have gone to the direction of, all right, now how does this work in 2D? But I'm actually 90% sure the 2 dimensions are just a red herring, and it's basically independent of X and Y. So I'm not even going to think about that. Instead, the more interesting question is what I found in my research, which is that this question is actually all about order statistics in disguise. If you think about it, if you have n sensors and you know that m of them are to the left of your target, what that tells you is your target is the m+1th example of all of these random variables sampled IID. And there's actually a really easy formula for that probability distribution right there on Wikipedia. And so at that point, I've got great new things to study during my next session. So yeah, that's a little bit of an approach of how I apply, my techniques, my steps to that particular question. And yeah, happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Awesome. So there's already a question here. And before that, I'm going to ask a question that I think other people are going to ask anyway. So if they're going to get it out there, I think both you and Scott are probably going to have good answers here. But are there kind of like standard questions to expect, or question types to expect rather, that, like more or less they're going to ask me, these 3 things that if you don't know this, then you're definitely not going to get it. And then obviously more detailed stuff. But I'm not sure if that was something you picked up during the most recent round. And then a follow-up question would be something more specific to you, just because I know you recently kind of moved probably from your other role, and just curious because I know for me, my experience, after I started interviewing and hiring people, my approach totally changed because I heard all the stupid answers that I used to give, and I'm like, oh, this is terrible. Now I feel like an idiot, but also now it's I'm much more efficient in answering questions and talking to people, understanding what they look for and what how I can actually add value. But I'm curious if that was an experience that you also had.
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, I guess starting with different types of questions. I mean, statistical tests are kind of the big one. I always prefer how do you use a statistical test to, some abstract academic probability question, because, you use it in your day-to-day life. But it could show up either way, right? It's how do you figure out where the 99th percentile is, whatever. Or it could be just how do you use it? A bunch of different ways that can come up. Usually programming questions come up. I'm trying to think. There's almost always been a programming component to my technical screens. Yeah, Scott, feel free to chime in. I'm blanking on various types right now.
Yeah, a lot of the programming ones, it's, in my experience, it's been something along the lines of SQL, querying a table and doing some data manipulation. So not asking you to create some machine learning model, but more so do something on the data wrangling side.
Yeah. Yeah, I think every machine learning problem I've gotten in a technical interview, I've been able to solve with linear regression. So.
Well, there you have it. If you have 2 people who tell you can do that, it's probably something that if you're not good at, I would suggest definitely diving into. Was that?
So thinking about it, there are only certain classes of questions that can actually be technical interviews, right? They have to be answerable in an hour under stress. So they really can't be the most complicated questions.
Ideally.
I'm sure you all have your stories of you walk into an interview and you got just some off the wall question. I know it happens. Sometimes someone's a prick and they just want to mess with the candidate. It happens.
Or worse, they're not necessarily trying to do it intentionally. It's just a great question they found the hour before, and they're like, "Oh, this will make a great interview question." They don't think about it. Most interviews are worse at their side of the table than you are at your side of the table.
I had a colleague one time, we were drafting interview questions, and he was like, what's your biggest weakness? Which is the dumbest question, because for me, I'm I don't really give a shit, right? It's how can you do the thing that I'm interviewing you for? What you're weak at is less important to me. But his goal is rattle someone, and so he was and then tell me what your next biggest weakness is. we had a fight. But
Talk about a wrathful deity.
I went over his head over because I was like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, really. No, that's a red flag. If you get that in a technical interview, go home.
Yeah, exactly. Then it's like you don't want to work there. Even if you get the offer, you're going to leave in 3 months anyway. So some of the questions that just came in, mostly folks are looking for, or at least initially, some resources to prepare. What are like the standard things you should be reading?
Google. Yeah, I mean, like I see LeetCode there. LeetCode's a good example. I mean, you should, if you want to work in data and you want to keep your career in data, you should always be learning. So you should have a standard, like, I'm going to spend this amount of time per week on learning new questions. And like either that's some technique that you're going to apply for work, or that can be professional development directed at job interviews. LeetCode's a great starting point, but I don't know. Like, honestly, I think Stack Overflow and Quora were where I got started. Just in terms of like what to expect from interviews and what questions are going to be relevant. But yeah, I mean, realistically, after you do a few interviews, you've got your own bank, right? You can remember all the ones that went well and refresh those, and then brush up the ones that didn't go so well.
Yeah, that's like the next question we have here is how do you choose which questions go in your mental map? But I think what you just said, for me, I mean, I'm obviously not a data scientist, so I've not gone through a data science interview, but I've been on the screening end of lots and lots of technical people. But just personally, it's like you learn, to your point, like so much from messing up interviews, because then you learn like the jargon you're supposed to use. You're like, oh, this one didn't work out, I probably shouldn't do that again. And then like you find once you start doing that, you actually, not to say that you get the next offer or whatever, but like you realize the conversation went a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so maddening, like trying to optimize your behavior based on yes or no, did I get an interview? Because that's such a sparse, noisy signal. You really have to learn. Yeah, you got to get external feedback, or you have to learn to evaluate your own performance. Yeah,
and then also like so many times it's like there are lots of people who are like really good. And so like, I mean, I know we basically like flip coins at some point. We're like, we both like these two people, it's like equal votes across the board. And it's like, we can only make one offer. So it's like this person's first choice, this person, like we put them in a holding pattern and we just like pray that they don't find something else faster. And like, you can't really beat yourself up, although it's hard, right? It's very easy to say that. But when you're just staring at like 10 straight rejections, you're like, what am I doing wrong? And it's like, you don't get, until you've been on the other side of the table, you don't see the perspective. And even now, if someone doesn't like me, I take it personally. I'm like, what do you mean? It's so hard.
That's an excellent answer too to my, the earlier question, how did things change in this job search after I'd been on the other side hiring people? And yeah, like you really see how much stochasticity there is in the process. Like, what questions did you ask? Did they happen to align with this candidate's experience? This candidate really didn't know how to do conditional probability. They might have just been having a bad day, but got to be fair to the other candidates. Yeah, don't take anything personally is really what I learned, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
And yeah, one thing I wanted to follow up on was through this talk, you did a great job talking about the process of preparing for an interview. Is there anything that you do differently if you had multiple interviews within a given time frame?
It's an interesting
or is it just
question.
a matter of the same things at scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would imagine. So I would imagine I would be interviewing for similar enough roles that the narrative would apply to both roles. Probably similar enough skill sets. But I don't know. There's no reason why you necessarily need to have a unique narrative about why you're there for each individual interview. So maybe there would be, maybe you can scale in that direction. I think, again, if there's overlap in terms of what you should study for the interview, that makes mental mapping easy. You can do the same work for essentially both interviews. But I mean, I don't know. To quote my college advisor, everything you learn makes you smarter. So don't hesitate to study for both interviews, or indeed as many interviews as you have.
As long as you have the time, yeah. And obviously, like if folks are here, if they haven't heard my soapbox before, I will continue to say it. If you aren't reaching out to people and just asking them and just talking to them, just saying, hey, like, what would you ask? Like, it sounds stupid, but it's so valuable, because then you, at least one, like if you're like, I've never heard of that, it could be an outlier. Obviously talk to 10 people if you can, but if you've never heard of it, it's probably something you should focus on. But has anything changed for you in terms of like, looking back now, like thinking about people who are kind of like going for their first data role, like what should people be studying? Like, has that changed in the last like 4 or 5 years? Like, what's like the new thing that like is more important? I mean, aside from your basics, like if you're bad at SQL, you've got some problems. You should probably fix that part. But like, what's next?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know. Honestly, like the bread and butter you need for intro roles hasn't changed. SQL, SQL and linear regression will get you so far. I mean, that being said, like I almost never use it in work, but I do look really impressive in interviews sometimes by staying abreast of what's going on in the research frontier, right? Like 2020 was a great year for self-supervised computer vision. I managed to make proof of concepts, taking some of those ideas and applying them to recommendation contexts as well. That really looked good in my interview with Proby. Nothing I put to production. It was a lab time day. It was a Jupyter notebook, but lo and behold, like it's cool. Like it's something that we didn't know about 2 years ago, and I know about that now.
That actually brings up a really interesting question, and Scott can chime in as well. I'm sure you've got either a point or a follow-up question, but like I think oftentimes like we're so focused on getting the job, getting past the interview that we forget that oftentimes it's like very different. Like what you're being tested on is like different than like what you actually have to do. Like, I don't know if you can give like an example or kind of just like walk through like, hey, typically we get tested on this, but actually my day job is like I never use SQL. I only do whatever.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've never reversed a doubly linked list. I think that's the standard one. I haven't gotten that question specifically, but I've gotten, we have all these numbers. How can we do something n squared in n log n kind of way? That being said, I've used like big O notation. Sometimes that's been useful. It's good to have that level of understanding in the abstract, but the level of detail is almost never what's necessary on the questions to solve in the interview.
That's interesting. During this last round of interviews, was there ever like was there one of those interviews where you're just like, I'm done? Like you walked in, they asked you a question, and you're just like, this is stupid.
I don't think so, actually. I think I've gotten lucky in that respect. Plus, like every interview, you can learn stuff, right? Like,
yeah, sure.
Even if I've given up, like this is not a job I want. It's still like I'm sitting there with another data scientist. I can pick their brain. I can get further context about the company. I can try to understand, like, well, is this guy just having a bad day, or is this in a bad environment, or what? There's always more to learn. And like, I don't know, once you decide you don't want the job, then you can just enjoy it. It's so much easier.
It's so much easier. I used to take job interviews for fun.
Yeah.
You learn a lot, and you get to like sharpen your narrative, your pitch. You got to get better at it. And when you don't care about getting it, then you're willing to take risks. Actually, like my recommendation, and I don't know if this is something that other people share, or maybe I'm just crazy. Probably a little bit of both, but I like to like take those jobs where I'm like, even if I got offered it, I probably wouldn't take it, or I wouldn't want to work at that company, or I'm not driving out to that location ever. Those kinds of things. And then you can be a little more flippant with your answers. And for me, it helps me with my confidence. And oddly enough, people they like me more, and I'm like, I figure out how to channel that.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Yeah, I mean, even if you're really content in your present role, take a job interview. Keep your skills sharp.
Well, then you also just figure out how much you're worth.
Just
looking to negotiate salary bumps. I'm not sure if either of you have experience kind of leveraging those kinds of conversations and understand like, hey, actually, it turns out what I know is really cool and people want it. How do I get more from, even if you like what you're doing, which, I mean, if you like what you're doing, it's great. Like no sense in switching necessarily, but if they're going to pay you more, I mean, you might as well. I think it never hurts to raise your hand and say like, how do I get this?
Yeah, indeed. Everything you can learn from a job interview, you should try to learn.
Totally agree.
Somebody's questioning your for fun comment. Interviews for fun.
Exactly. And I totally follow up on that. For fun, it sounds crazy, but I say for fun, but maybe a better way of putting it is for practice. But it feels more fun because I know I'm not going to take it no matter what. And so like, even if I only get to 2 interviews or whatever, as long as like the amount of effort I have to put into it isn't crazy, I learn a lot about the industry. I learn, like, you get asked, for me, it's like, I was told once by, we'll call him a mentor, for lack of a better word. But like, you win the interview when you get the other person to do the most talking. And you gotta like learn, like, man, you gotta ask them like, what are the biggest problems you have at your company? What are the biggest challenges in the next 6 months? Why do you want this role? Why am I interesting? That's the fun part, because the answer is someone handed me a resume 5 minutes ago, and I'm trying to make something up. But I enjoy putting people on on the on the defense and letting them kind of wiggle out of it, because you seem like a better candidate.
Yeah, indeed. If you come in with the attitude, you have to convince me to accept an offer, well, psychologically, that actually works.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that strategy is going to get you to the offer stage, but it'll certainly
not ubiquitously, but
I mean, they're all we're all nerds here, right? The pun intended. Each interview is a data point. Each person you talk to is a data point.
You're interviewing them, as you mentioned in your talk. I think you have to keep that part in mind.
Yeah. That was one thing I learned the hard way. Tommy's got a question about how deep of an understanding of stats do you need to know? He's a strong coder, could do SQL, but didn't go through theory. I think there's a lot of if there's like bootcamp people on here, I think that's like very typical, right? It's like you learn how to do stuff, you learn how to ship it, provision it, whatever, but you've never actually, or not never, like likely didn't go through all this theory that someone with like a master's or a PhD went through.
Yeah, and the honest answer is it depends on the role. If you're a machine learning engineer, you don't really need much stats. You need enough. You need to understand the basic computations you're doing. And I don't know, you don't need too much deep theory. So for that job interview that was a train wreck for me that I described earlier, that would have been much more heavily statistics based. It was building out an experimentation platform. So how do we choose samples essentially? Well, very heavy statistics. They were correct not to extend me an offer after I could not answer that question they asked me.
Well, when you look at those kinds of roles, because I think so many times you see a data scientist role or an analyst role, and they all kind of look the same. It's like they put the same like crappy job description up, but like when you're approaching it, how do you go through and make sure that like, hey, this thing is like not too advanced on like this one skill I don't have, or how do you like pick the stuff to apply for?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, at this point, like I'm at the point now after about 5 years where I can read a job description and say, I have done something that describes that. I think that's what they mean, or I don't know what that is. Maybe I'll ask them or somebody else. And that's kind of how I go. I don't know. Scott, any good thoughts about this one? Good question.
It is a good question. I don't have an answer to it. It just spurred another thought in my head, so I apologize for that. But I'm going to say it anyways, is that I think I've seen some people get thrown off for a job interview requisition thinking that they have to hit every bullet point that's on there. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, go for the spirit of what the rec is saying rather than just each bullet point. Like I said, not answering the question, but it just kind of came into my head and I'm going to spurt it out anyways.
Oh yeah, no, always helpful. Well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, like part of the fun of having three of us on here is that now we can actually get multiple viewpoints and multiple points of experience. And I was hoping Scott would dive into the stats part, because I'm like, that's the one thing. I remember when I first met you, I was like, you're a data scientist. And you said,
yeah.
No, I'm a statistician. but anyway, but it's one of those things where it's like going back to like interviewing, and when I meet people who I think one point that like, so I've worked in a lot of coding boot camps and what have you, and like you struggle to differentiate yourself. And I think one thing, and this is my personal viewpoint, so if someone tells you differently, feel free to follow their advice. But like if you get like a certificate that says you're a data scientist, don't lead with, hi, I'm a data scientist, when you don't have a job as a data scientist. It's really hard. Then my next question is like, which bootcamp did you go to? And it kind of just like, goes downhill from there. It's a lot easier to just say, hey, I'm like doing this, or I'm looking for it to break in, or I've got this background or whatever. Here we got a question about how do you go about getting multiple offers? How do you stack that? Is there like a process for that? I mean, sometimes it's a bit of luck in the sense of like you got, some companies move quickly, some don't. But is there like a strategy you guys follow to try and stack interviews properly?
I've tried. I haven't pulled it off yet.
Very nice. Scott, is there something?
I think you get to a point there that interviewing itself is a skill. We talk about being the interviewee and the skills you have to prep for that, but also actually doing the interviews itself is a skill. And
it really is. I mean, I'm trying to bring on a speaker who works at Microsoft, and I was just asking him like, hey, like you do a lot of interviews. Tell me about like, is it when you're hiring people, is it like, do you have better interviews with people who are more experienced? this kind of thing. And he's like, honestly, interviewing itself is a skill. He's like, I have people who have like deep experience and just bomb the interview. And I'm like, well, if you haven't figured out how to do this part yet, I don't want to hire you, but like you have a good resume. And so I think you guys are right.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's a challenge
On both sides of the coin. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's even worse when on both sides of the coin, because then you see all the fuck ups, but sometimes you can't. You like see them, but like it's kind of like, this is a totally non-technical off-work kind of example. But has anyone ever like, you're falling over on like your chair, your office chair? Maybe you did it like last year, or maybe you're whatever. But it's going to happen, and sometimes you can't like stop it, and you're like, oh no, it's going to go, and I'm going to look like an idiot. Maybe that's just me, but sometimes
it's important to remember, right? Like, I don't know, there are a few people where like, yes, I've looked like an idiot in front of them at a job interview, and I do hope never to meet them again. But that's honestly the worst thing that's ever happened in a job interview. Right?
Yeah, you're never going to see them again, so who cares? It's easy to say that now. Like, now that I've learned that like the worst thing that's going to happen is like, you think that like they care so much, but really I've interviewed enough people, and like people sound like total idiots sometimes. That like I forget about it, because I'm like, when you go through 5 interviews a day, like
you forget the idiots. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, right? So you're not going out of your way to go and like screw someone over. Like all you're doing is like not moving them forward on a lever. Although I have gotten some very, very interesting follow-up emails from people who were upset, but that's it is what it is. Not petty at all. What is the dress code?
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm wearing right now, basically. Usually, I do put on a button-down shirt. I try to go like one level nicer than I think I have to. But honestly, these days, tech companies, I don't know, wear clothes.
Yeah, it's going to depend.
Especially the tech side.
Yeah.
If you're in sales or marketing, maybe you probably don't wear a t-shirt and jeans necessarily.
Fair enough. Yes.
I've seen some awful things at when I was in the coding bootcamp. So yeah, just don't be disheveled.
Yeah. I think that's an okay question to ask. Not okay. I think a great question to ask to a recruiter too, if you are concerned about it.
Big time. Yeah, actually, a good recruiter is actually really, really valuable, right? Because you feel comfortable asking those kinds of questions. At the end of the day, like they want to move you forward. Like they get paid for you to be successful. So like feel free to ask all the questions you want, and if they can't answer it, the good one will just tell you straight up and just say, hey, like I can't answer that, but here's all the stuff you should do.
Yeah. Like, what questions will they ask on the tech screen is a great question for your recruiter.
Oh, awesome. What any more questions people should be asking their recruiters? That's actually something I didn't think to ask you guys, but that's a great question.
That's a good one. Yeah, dress code, expectations, schedule is a good one for me, sort of just so I know what to expect. Other ones too. What am I not thinking of, Scott?
No, those are some of the big ones. I mean, you might ask what kind of computer you're going to be working on, what platform
is. Yeah.
I don't know. Benefits are always a good thing to ask about. How's the weather?
Yeah.
I think you touched
how's the weather where you are? I guess you can see if they're lying about their location pretty quickly. Assuming it's like, oh, it's a great day in Chicago. I'm like, it's really
lovely. You're not in Chicago.
It's easier in the Bay Area, right? It's like it's never like amazing, or rarely, but it's never like 2 feet of snow. So oh man. So I unless there's, I'll give folks a chance to go ask one last question. But other than that, I think this has been really good. While we're waiting for that, I think other question I'll ask. We've talked a lot about the technical interview. I never asked about like when you're talking to a technical recruiter by doing their initial phone screen. Aside from questions you should be asking them, like what do they typically? How do they screen you to make sure that you're even worth bringing into the technical interview? Here we go. And then the follow-up is, how do you learn about company culture? That'll be the final question.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, I mean, like tech screens are typically even more limited in scope than technical interviews. So usually these days it's like a link to a leap code exercise or something. That's a pretty common technique. Other than that, it can be like even just talking about projects you worked on in the past, sort of a more behavioral approach to it. I've seen that happen recently. So I don't know. I approach them basically the same way. I think about what kinds of things I might get asked, and they tend to be not as in-depth though. So they tend to be, typically I find preparing for the technical interview gets me ready for the tech screen as well.
Yeah. The screens usually, I mean, especially if it's with like a technical recruiter, only so much they know. Unless it was like someone who was hyper technical and then chose to do the recruiting life, which every now and then you find, but not super common. So company culture. It's a great question. It's hard to get immediately because sometimes like the team is good, but culture is bad or that sort of thing. How do you guys do it? Obviously, there's all the online forums, but as we all know from like surveys, it's either a 1 or a 5, right? It's either amazing or it was like totally terrible. I don't know if you guys have an approach to like, trying to figure out, get a pulse for the company culture.
Yeah, honestly, that's what I use the interview for. Like, it's a large part of my interview process. It's like, so tell me, like, what questions are we solving? Why are we solving these questions? Who is insisting that these are the questions that we solve, right? You can sort of begin to feel between the lines and get some idea of what it might be like to work there. I also look at like, are the people happy? That's a really big one. I have been at highly prestigious companies where like, none of you seem to be enjoying yourselves. Maybe I won't take this offer. So the interview is actually really
and I'd like to ask what unique things that the people enjoy or stand out to them about the company. And I think you learn a lot about the culture when there's something that you're like, wow, I haven't heard that before. It's not just canned answers. And you're like, okay, there really is a unique culture here.
Oh yeah. It's always nice to ask like why you like working here. And if they don't have a good canned answer, one, like that might be a problem in and of itself. But that was like
true too. If it takes, they're like, I never thought of that. That might not be a great sign.
It's a softball answer, but like if you can't do it, so like last week when we asked Daniel that question, I was like, I'm gonna start out with a softball because someone asked it, and I was like, this is always great, especially if you're like telling us you have like 5 open roles. If you don't get this one right, I don't think anyone's gonna want to work for you. But yeah, no, at least that's my personal opinion. Obviously, is take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, Glassdoor is a good place to start, though. I mean, it's not going to be ubiquitous, right? You have to remember, the experience throughout the company can be very different from one team to another. So do take those with a grain of salt. Yeah,
but also, obviously, like you'll see them, and if you see it like repeatedly, like the same message that comes out, I think that's the way I look at things like Glassdoor. Is it's like there are companies that I've worked for where it's like to the extent where you could probably identify if you know the person well enough, like that who wrote the comment, even when it's anonymous. But when you see like similar comments, like you kind of A/B test, if you will, all of like the negative reviews, and they're like 80% of them are like one thing, well, there might be an issue.
Yeah. The other thing I do is sort by star rating and skip past the 5s and only look at the 3 through 2s if they exist.
No, it's true. Yeah. It's helpful to understand what the issues could be, right? Like at the end of the day, they might not be things that bother you, or they might be like someone who's just annoyed, which happens. But it's good to at least know that these could be issues. And then, I mean, heck, like depending on like how bold you are, you could ask the interviewer, like, "Hey, I've seen a lot of this. Can you shed some light on some of these issues, if there are issues?"
I've actually done that before, and I got complimented. Wow, you've really done your homework.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well then, we know it works, and we know that they don't just reject you automatically when you when you bring it up. All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks, guys. I know we took a full hour of your time. For everyone who's asking, this is going to be recorded. It's actually on YouTube right now. So if you go and see it, it should be automatically uploaded. And then I'll go back and fix it a little bit and take out anything that sounds stupid. But like that comment there. But it is on there, just like all of our other ones. I'm a bit behind on uploading some stuff, but for the most part, all of our talks are on YouTube. But again, really, I mean, thanks for coming. This has been really informative. I learn a lot every time, and it sounds trivial and stupid, but like it's actually true. Kind of at the end, like I didn't think about what questions to ask your recruiter, so that's like super helpful. For folks who are on LinkedIn right now, if you guys could give us a like or a follow, that's really helpful. More importantly, each time we go live, you'll get a notification. So if you forgot to join one day or have you'll see it, and you'll be able to get it And of course, like you'll see the recording on LinkedIn too. So always helpful. And with that, hope to see everyone next time. For anyone who wants to learn about Spotify, check that out. The week after, I have LinkedIn, so it'll be good like big tech companies. It'll be kind of, for those of you who are going through that data journey, a lot of experience, whether it's like through boot camps or more non-traditional ways of breaking into tech and breaking into data. Because I think what we've learned through all of these is there's not one good answer. And they're all very, very different. And like often you don't have to have like the perfect education. It's helpful, but also often sometimes being unique is also helpful in and of itself, because you are different, and at least they'll look at you. So with that, I think we'll sign off. Hope to see everyone again next time, and thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Have a
Aaron.
good night.
Thanks, Scott.